Council, you may continue.
Thank you. Ms. LaViolette, just before we finish talking about the continuum, and this is Exhibit 558, have you ever used this in court before?
Yes, I've used it in family court primarily because there was a perception that there was a flight risk with a father who had dual passports, and he didn't fit into what is commonly seen as a perpetrator. He wasn't like the guy on television or the guy in the movies, but he clearly fit in to somewhere between some of the characteristics of abuse and some of the characteristics of battering. So it was used to explain to the court what that range of behavior could look like.
Well, and when you talk about range of behavior, when you're looking at a potential batterer or a potential abuser, perpetrator, is it possible for them to have characteristics of more than one of these columns?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They can. That's why it's a continuum, because there can be behaviors from different categories that are present in one person.
All right. And ultimately, after you created this continuum, was it ever published anywhere?
It was published in the Journal of Child Custody, which is a peer-reviewed journal. That means that other people in your profession are asked to look at it and review it and decide whether it's worthy of publication or not.
So when something's peer-reviewed, does that mean those people who are looking at it, do they have the ability to say, no, it's not worthy?
Yes, they do. In fact, I'm a peer reviewer for the Journal of Child Custody, and sometimes we get an article that we just don't think is up to standard, and you can either recommend that people rewrite it if there are minor changes, or you can recommend that it not be published at all, and so that happens.
Okay. And this morning when we're talking about this continuum, and you're talking about the batterers or the perpetrators, you talk about them having control over their family members or the fear that they can instill in the family. When you talk about family, who are you talking about?
I'm not necessarily talking about family in the standard kind of way, because it can be people who very much care about them. So they don't have to be living with that person. They don't have to be married to that person, but they need to be intimate enough that that person really cares about them.
And is there a correlation in the work that you've done between people who, the type of abuse or the more serious of abuse that can occur with the type of relationship between the abuser and the victim?
Generally speaking, in intimate partner violence, most of the rage is directed at the intimate partner, but it can also be directed at children as well if there are children involved. Otherwise, it tends to be directed at the safest target, and that tends to be the intimate partner, adult partner.
Why is the intimate partner a safe target?
Because the intimate partner is probably not going to tell anybody about it, and the intimate partner has, if they're married, they've made a promise to stay. If they're not married, they've probably made some kind of a commitment in terms of just loving each other. And because people are generally more cautious when there are logical consequences and witnesses, which is why you don't see a lot of people who are perpetrating domestic violence are not acting out at the workplace. Because if they act out at the workplace, there are witnesses and there are logical consequences right away. And when you're at home, there might be the consequence that your partner gets upset with you, but generally it takes a lot longer time before your partner would leave, or there would be a logical consequence like the police coming or something like that. And there are no witnesses other than the people that you're intimate with.
Okay. You talked about intimate partner violence. Is that, I don't know if you've used that term yet, but is that somehow different than domestic violence?
Actually, intimate partner violence is the new terminology because it covers people that aren't married. And when you talk about family violence or domestic violence, sometimes people think you're talking about child abuse as well. So they've kind of called it intimate partner violence now.
Is that the new terminology?
That's the new one, yeah.
Okay. All right. There's a lot to be said about intimate partner violence where one partner will stay. And it rises, I'm sure the answer to that is something long, and I don't want to go there yet, but my question is can you walk us through a domestic violence relationship? I mean, how does it start?
Well, I use this kind of example when I'm doing training because the question I'm still asked the most is why does someone stay in an abusive relationship? So what I try to do is make it something that we can all get, because most of us would fit in this kind of a situation. So I usually walk people through, I ask people to think about the very first time they were in love, the first time they were really seriously involved with somebody. And usually that's late teens, early 20s, in the 20s sometime. And I ask them to think about what that's like for them and where they learned about being in love. I ask them to think about what they saw in their own families, what they've seen on television, what they've seen in the movies, what books they've read. For some of us, we can go back to the radio, what we heard on the radio. So to look at this range of places that we get information. And so I ask people to think about that. And then I ask them to put themselves in their first relationship and what that was like for them. And I tell them, I have a couple theories about relationship, and one of them is that most of us could live with someone who was abusive for about a year, and we could live with them. And if we were in love, we wouldn't notice, because they would be on their best behavior for a period of time. And the energy of new love is bigger than the energy of fear. And for a lot of people who are abusive, they're really coming from a place of fear, even more than rage, and the rage kind of covers that up. So I talk about that a little bit, and then I ask them to think about being in this relationship and spending time with this person and going out on dates and meeting each other's friends and maybe eventually meeting each other's family and having some holidays together. And then this person that you love gets angry at you and gives you the silent treatment for a day or two. And you're kind of wondering what's going on, and you're a little nervous. And then that person calls you back like nothing's happened and you're fine. And then you go a little further into the relationship, and the person gets angry at you and calls you some names that you find really offensive and you're upset with. And then I ask people, do you think you would leave at this point when a person calls you these names that you don't like? What do you think you would do? Do you think you would leave? And most people say no. And so I ask them to go a little further in the relationship. And now you decide that you're really serious about each other, so you're spending more time together. And as you're spending more time together, some other things happen. And you get in an argument, and this argument's a little different than the other arguments that you've had. And during this argument, your partner picks up something that you care about and throws it into the wall and breaks it. And I ask people, would you leave now? And most people say no. And by the way, it hasn't mattered what group I've spoken to. I speak to all kinds of groups. I speak to church groups and professional organizations and probation officers and therapists, and it doesn't seem to matter. It's pretty consistent.
Okay.
And then I go a little further, and I say, now you've been together, and maybe you've been together about a year and a half or two, and maybe you decide you're going to live together, or maybe you decide that you're just going to keep seeing each other, and you're really tight with each other. And you have an argument this time that's different than any of the other arguments that you've had. And in this argument, your partner slaps you across the face. Now, you're very involved in this relationship, and you love this person. Do you think you're going to stop loving and liking somebody because they hit you? And most people say no, that is not true for them. And they think about getting angry, and they get upset. And I said, how do you feel when somebody does that to you? And people are upset, and most people believe that in a relationship they should be treated well, that they shouldn't be hitting or being hit, that sort of thing. But they also have a clash of values at the very beginning of that relationship. And the clash of values is, I shouldn't be mistreated, but I should be a forgiving human being. I should be a compassionate human being. I should be an empathetic human being. I should stand behind somebody through thick and thin, which a lot of us believe. If we've made any promises in the relationship, we think about those promises and commitments we've made in the relationship. And what winds up happening is those things tend to weigh more than the thing that says, the value that says I shouldn't be mistreated.
So
and
is that, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
is that the ultimate then clash that this person, the victim, for lack of a better term, is that the ultimate, what they're going through, is the feelings of being treated poorly versus being the good person who forgives? There's
that clash very early on. And it's confusing, I think, for any human being because we all, I believe, come up with the belief that we should be good human beings, and we have standards for that. And those standards are important. Those beliefs are important. And I think define who we are. I think that they're significant to us. And so you've got this clash of, different beliefs that are coming together at that point. But there may be more on the being a good person than there are on protecting yourself.
And so when you're having this clash of between these two feelings, is that something that is, in your experience, keeping people staying in the relationship?
It does, particularly at the beginning, because you believe that there's a possibility of change. And there's a concept that Kate Muldery coined back in the 80s called learned hopefulness.
What is that?
Excuse me?
What is that?
Okay. Well, there was a term called learned helplessness that was a psychological kind of experiment. And people thought that victims, and we call them survivors too, that stay in relationship because they feel helpless. They feel like it doesn't matter what they do, that doesn't change what happens to them. So there is that. But one of my colleagues did a really significant piece of research, Ola Barnett, on battered women, and found that the two major reasons they stayed was hope and fear. And that hope was really big. That between episodes, you have time to regroup, you have time to fall back in love with that person or care about that person, your anger goes away, and you have an opportunity to believe that things are going to change. And when that happens, you develop a pattern of hope. And I think what's interesting for me is that that's a good thing for most of us. Hope keeps us, if we're in a position where we've just lost our job, it keeps us in a position to think, well, I'll get another job and I'll be able to support my family, I'll be able to do this and that. So it's a good thing. But in an abusive relationship, it winds up backfiring to a certain degree because it keeps people kind of stuck.
Okay, and you mentioned fear, the other part of the
yeah,
research?
And fear takes a longer time usually to develop.
Okay. All right. And so you were walking us through where we get to the relationship with, and after all this time now, the person has slapped the other partner.
Yeah.
And in most of your teachings and speaking, and in your experience, are people telling you commonly that they wouldn't leave?
They most commonly tell me they wouldn't leave. And people who are in positions that seem powerful, like probation officers and that sort of thing, I've had people come up to me after so many of my speaking engagements. They come up and they say, I don't want anybody to know this. Can I talk to you? And I either give them my card so they can call, or we go in another area and talk, because there's a lot of shame attached to being a woman or a man who has money, who has the ability to leave and doesn't leave, because they're not looking at the emotional reasons that people don't leave.
Well, that brings up a good point. So if somebody has the financial ability to leave, does that mean they're going to leave necessarily?
Not at all. When I worked at the shelter, we saw a lot more women who were, didn't have money and didn't have resources. They might not have had family around to stay with. They may not have had the money to stay in a hotel. And so because there's not a lot of bed space in any given city, you have to sort of sift through people's issues and really prioritize who you're going to take into the shelter. So when women had resources, we might plug them into counseling or something like that, but